Okay, I hope this works out, and I apologize if I go into a coughing fit, but I'll attempt not to. I'm just looking for sympathy because, you know, you're stuck in on your own, aren't you, when you have COVID on the whole. However, so I just want to, what I'm going to do really is I've just got to set up kind of a preamble before we get into this, and then I will ask Nicola to move through the slides. What we thought we'd do, there were some questions that for consideration and reflection, and we just give people some time, and then for people to just come in and make their comments. I think it's going to be our best way of working at this. I might finish earlier, Nicola, than
That's fine.
than intended. Apologies for that. Yeah. So, okay. So I'm Philomena Harrison. I'm a social work academic, and I've been a social work academic since I don't know when, about 1990. And I can say really that I've spent all of that time, apart from teaching students and supporting them through placements, etc., spent a lot of that time trying to promote the development of anti-racist and anti-oppressive practice within social work education, and working with social workers. I've done training on anti-racist practice over the years with practitioners, and you know, even with the other practitioners besides social workers, like nurses, for example. So I've been kind of working at this for a long time, and I think since the creation of the Each One Teach One, and with the support of Nicola in her role as the project manager for the partnership, been given new and different opportunities, I'd say, to talk about the whole area of race and racism and anti-oppressive practice. So specifically with the Each One Teach One group, which has been a really interesting experience in working with people to develop these conversations. And I continue, as I say, to do this in in different ways, and that includes writing and teaching, and my engagement with students, who I think whose feelings and ideas are very much have been reflected in the conversations that people have had, and comments that people have made today. I was thinking as I was listening today, I wasn't quite sure whether it's best to or not to speak first or last. And what I've been can say from today, really, it's been quite useful to listen to all the conversations and your contributions from people who are attending today. And it's been good, really, to hear articulated the scope of the other conversations that people have presented on today. And that scope really was, I saw it in the responses that people have tried to make. And what I think clearly has come through is, for me anyway, was our capacity to sit with that discomfort. Indeed, I think the need for that process to happen in order to engage with change. And, you know, I'm making the presumption for those of us who might have been silent that we didn't have thoughts, that we didn't have reflections. And I hope that we'll be able to take that back into your practice. What also struck me very much was how the conversations have connected to each other as we've gone through, and certainly how the conversations and the ideas that people have developed and spoken about are connected with mine. So one of the things I think I needed to kind of say really before going into any detail was that I wanted to comment again around the language about difference, the language around racism. BAME, Black and Global Majority, Black as a political or a collective description, which signaled really racial oppression. In my slides, I've used BAME, which is Black, Asian and minority ethnic in my slides. And I think, as somebody said earlier, you know, if you're asked to change, if you're asked to discuss it, that shouldn't be problematic. And I think I'm open to change all of the time. And when, you know, there will be the times when we need to and must mention specific groups. For example, certainly since the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, I've often had to, in conversations around race, following the period immediately after the tragedy and the murder of George Floyd, was that we have to mention specific groups. And I know that I've been having to mention, thinking about the South Asian community, where certainly in America and here, there was a rise in racism because of the COVID issues that have arisen and continue to be there. So we need to think about people who are being oppressed because of their skin tone and their history. So all our conversations will bring discomfort, and that we all need to sit with that discomfort, and that is the process for how we can bring changes. I want to, as I try very hard to do, is positioning myself really in looking at and developing these conversations. What I want to say is that we also, and I think somebody did mention it earlier, that we need to talk about being white. Yeah, we need to have those conversations. We need to take those risks to have those conversations. For me personally, I am no longer pleading for my humanity. I already knew that. It was established when I was born. I want us to look away from conversations that are based on a victim mentality. I've worked my way through those moments of discomfort, and I know that there will be many more. I want to just say to you, before I forget to say this to you, that as practitioners, as social work practitioners, you know, we're working with a whole range of vulnerable people, and that in that process, your silence will not protect you. When I've been silent, I haven't been protected. And I've drawn on that saying from the Black feminist writer, Audre Lorde. So remembering your silence will not protect you. You have to have these conversations. So Nicola, if you can just move the next slide, please. So, and I want you just to read through this quote because it encapsulates really some of the reasoning behind why we are where we are in some of these situations where people experience the extremes of racism in our society. So when the structures of domination identify a group of people, as racist ideology does Black folks in this society, and this is Bell Hooks, who died recently, talking about American society. When we identify a group of people as mentally inferior, implying that they are more body than mind, it should come as no surprise that there is little societal concern for the mental health care of that group. And I want to say here then that my ideas about producing this conversation have arisen out of a series of lectures I do with students on looking at race and mental health. And I use this quote really as our starting point to enable us to think about those structures. And many of the conversations that have been spoken about today have identified what those structures are, whether they're in criminal justice, whether to do with white privilege, whether to do with language that we use, whether it helps us understand what anti-racist practice is about. All of those conversations have asked us to think about the structures that create these racist experiences, which produce racist policy making, which ignore particular groups. Okay, next slide. I feel it with COVID, I can be a Chris Whitty and go next slide, please. Okay, sorry. What is trauma then? So trauma then, and I've just got a list of things here in terms of how we talk about trauma. So it's the body's natural response to stress, high threats, danger, traumatic events, traumatic situations. They create conditions that cause us acute distress and often ongoing physical, socio-emotional, and psychological strain. So I'm trying to take us from thinking about what is stress, what is trauma, and what that might mean in relation to thinking about racism as trauma. So the impact means that it threatens the individual's safety. Yeah. And if we think about that, just think about a racist situation that somebody might be experiencing, whether it be name calling or whatever. Yeah. Threatens the individual's safety, disrupts their normal everyday thoughts, feelings, and ways of being. You know, it's a huge impact when you're experiencing such an event. And I'll just give a quick example. Not so long ago, I was walking down the pavement, and I live actually in Sale, which is around Manchester. And I was just walking along, and a young man comes along on a bicycle on the pavement, virtually pushes me off the pavement and says, "Get out of here, you black bastard." Yeah. So, okay, immediately I'm going, that's a threatful situation for me. My normal activity is disrupted, my feelings are disrupted, and my ways of being at that moment in time on a normal activity, which we would all do, which is going shopping. Yeah. So there's a physical and a psychological response, yeah, to that situation. Yeah. And the memories continue. Again, about a year or so ago, I was mugged in my car by a gang of about 6 young men, or young boys, really, from 14 downwards. And I know that when they pulled open my car and said, "Get out of the car," and used more racially abusive language, I know that when I go, it took me a long time to come to terms with car doors banging. It took me a long time to go back to where the event happened. Yeah. So the memories are there. They are part of who we are, and hopefully not what we become. Yeah. But it connects the past and the present. Yeah. So that's what trauma is about in terms of those events. And let's connect it to the experiences of racism, you know, overt or covert. I will try to look at that a little bit more. So this is what our conversation should be about. Thank you, Nicole. Okay, so what are the sources then? I've already started to give you some of them. They can be unsuspected. It was not something I was not expecting in terms of the 2 examples I've given you. And sometimes they can be unrecognizable, yeah, that we don't see it's happening until somebody points it out to us, yeah. And we, you know, this invisibility still has an impact in terms of a traumatic event on the individual. So I put in here sort of a suggestion, really. There's these unrecognized traumas negatively influence, for students certainly, our academic and ways that we are and how we develop. We're thinking about microaggressions, and I don't know whether we can have a quick think about what you think a microaggression might be. We can see them in other social divisions such as gender, etc. And one example I can actually give you is to often as an academic, when I've gone to placement visits, and this is not just been my experience of other Black colleagues who I have, being assumed to be the student and not the academic. So I don't know whether we want to try and think about some of those kind of situations. Or maybe I'll give you another. I hate silences, so I'll fill them for now.
Somebody's got their hand up.
Oh, okay, please. Karen.
Hiya. Hello, Philomena. I think I was just thinking back in practice, and I'm trying to think of kind of what I would, and now reflect on it and sort of say, yeah, that was microaggression. It was kind of supporting a Black male into care home and talking about the specific needs of that person, and having that discussion with the catering division, and talking about kind of what this, this person's really, what food that, that he absolutely loves, and being challenged constantly about, well, it's not part of our you know, it's nothing that we actually do, we buy it in, you know, and that element of trying to support somebody just to have a meal that he really enjoyed, and the difficulties of getting that. I think that's something that was bringing to mind when you were speaking.
Yeah, that's a really good example, because I was working once with somebody who was training to become an approved mental health practitioner, and one example she gave was that there was a Chinese gentleman on a ward, and he was described as being, you know, isolated. He was described as being depressed. He was described as, you know, not engaging in any group work or anything. And a simple action by somebody actually saying, you know, let's get a translator in here. And what they did discover really was he didn't speak any English. Yeah. So he couldn't, you know, and the nurses on the ward were saying, well, you know, we're doing our best with him. You know, we're ordering Chinese food all the time for him, but he doesn't eat it, and he, you know, and etc. And we're, you know, we're being kind of, you know, culturally appropriate, and etc. And what we discovered by the translator was the fact that the Chinese gentleman was of an older generation, and we need to understand those cultural differences. That's about cultural knowledge. And you know, and he didn't speak English. Yeah. But also and through the translator, he said, why can't I have fish and chips like everybody else? I'm sick of all this Chinese food. Yeah. So it's about, you know, how we engage with people, stepping back from those assumptions, you know, that we frequently make. And in our efforts to be anti-racist, we're actually traumatizing people even more and making those assumptions. Thanks, Karen.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. Kirsten's also put something in the chat about as a wife of a black man, people tend to look towards her during conversations rather than both of them. And this is like you know, happens on a daily basis for people of colour.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And I think for you people, obviously all of us as practitioners in some form, is like being aware of how that happens in teams. You know, where you know, who is listened to, I think, and who is listened to in terms of racist difference is a really important point for us to take to changing you know, our practice and thinking about these things. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we're trying to look really here as what are those sources, and for us as practitioners, team members, etc., to try and become aware of what those microaggressions might be, which in themselves are traumatic events. And another phrase I haven't put on the slides but want to think about is about you know, like battle fatigue, because you're fighting these things all the time, and that also has an impact on you. So I think, Nicola, maybe we should move to the next slide. Yeah. Okay. So thinking then about those kind of responses, and perhaps we've already started talking about them, but I'll continue in a way. And these are some areas that the people writing about racial trauma are talking about. Some of them you will be familiar with. So there's intergenerational responses, yeah, how our children are brought up, yeah, where you know, we talk to our children in terms of being compliant, you know, don't get into trouble, work twice as hard, yeah. You know, we have to accept the values of the dominant group, you know, don't be different, don't be different. And that's a powerful message which we give out, you know, to can give out to our children. Then often people feel shame. They feel shame towards their own community. And that's, we can talk about that in terms of internalized racism, which people often deny. I have worked with young people when I was a practicing social worker, where the power of the racist experiences. This young man spent a lot of his time saying that, you know, he was white, and you know, to have to be in that situation when you're in care in, I think, an endemically racist system of care, and not everybody will agree with me when I say that, but I think fundamentally is. Our society, there's endemic racism in our society, so it will be in all those other structures, in those social structures that we use, such as social work. So there's the difficulties with internalizing that racism, confusing and difficult for children and young people, and in some cases even for adults. And then there's this hypervigilance, yeah? You're expecting the next racist event. And we've talked about before, I think in the group that I was in, about being in terms of white privilege, about the impact of being the only Black person, and I'm using that term generally here, in any kind of situation. And people were saying that they, for the first time, when they were the only white person, felt what that might be like for somebody of color. Yeah. So you're there waiting for it to happen. Yeah. And that is a traumatic event. We work really hard to protect our children from everyday racisms, and connecting to the conversation about white privilege and what people have been saying. We don't need to do that. As white people, we don't need to do that. Yeah. So how do we, what is this extra parenting work that people from Black and Asian minority ethnic groups have to do in terms of protecting their children from everyday racisms? And then another impact is that people start to assimilate. And let's remember this, that was for many, many years in this country, that was and still is, I think, in new and different ways, the assumption that we should assimilate, that we should give up all our the differing cultural values, yeah, become invisible and accept the values and culture of the dominant group. And that's quite a powerful impact on certainly for me as a Black person, and would be for many, many others. Okay. Nicholas, can we go to the next one? Yeah, thank you. So and maybe I'm shooting through this faster than I need to. So let's take some time on this then. So these are questions for you to ask yourselves, and maybe you've already begun to ask those questions in talking in the previous conversation sessions. So as a social worker, what is the impact of my race on my thinking, beliefs, actions, decision-making, interventions, support? How can we work collaboratively with Black, Asian, and minority ethnic individuals, colleagues, and communities to better understand the impact of racial trauma? And I mentioned a little bit before, and this sense of racial battle fatigue. And I can tell you, I know what that feels like after 20 years of doing this. How do I situate and negotiate Black, Asian, and minority ethnic people with lived experiences, knowledge, experiences, expertise, and race or ethnicity with my own? How can I bring those experiences to make sense for me? And how do I use those experiences to promote a different way of working? And I wonder whether maybe we should just deal, if people can just, we give people some time, Nicola, and then perhaps just look at, as a social worker, what is the impact of my race on my thinking, beliefs, and actions?
Hello there.
Hi.
I can think of a couple of examples. When I was in practice a while back, when perhaps I wasn't thinking about the impact of my race on my thinking until I was confronted with examples of working with someone from a different background, different culture, different racial identity, and then I had to think very quickly, what are my assumptions here, what are my beliefs, what do I know about someone who's from a one of the examples was a lady from a Hindu background who was in a nursing home, I realised I didn't know very much about Hindu cultural tradition, and I thought I need to, I've neglected this because it's a bit late to say, oh, I need some CPD on this, because you have to actually do something then, and it all happens at once. So it's kind of regrettable in that sense that you have to learn on the job and not make space and plan for these eventualities.
I think that's a really important point, Tom, because and I think that it's important that we take an action. And like you say, I can't wait for a CPD on this. This is about my practice. This is about the quality of my practice, or my everyday practice. And when we draw it into our professionalism, then I think that there will be change. Because it addresses the structures, and it in a sense it just pushes the structures aside. Like, I don't need a CPD course on this. I know what I need to do as a professional person, to make this change. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, thank you. That's a really good example. Felicity?
I mean, I always feel like coming at this from a very sort of ignorant point of view, but when I was growing up, and say, obviously from my accent, I don't come from this sort of the Northwest. So when I was growing up, my parents were really quite supporters of Enoch Powell. And I can remember sort of thinking, this is sort of something about it, but not really knowing. And then many years before I was a social worker, I worked in London, and I had an Indian boyfriend. And his brother was getting married to a white girl. And he was talking to me about how his parents were really very much against this, because they wanted him to marry a nice Indian girl and not a horrible, dirty white girl, basically. And that had a massive effect on me, because I sort of, the assumption that I had grown up with was that white was better. And that made me really sort of question absolutely every assumption that I had about that. And that is something I was probably at that point, I think I was probably about 22, 23. And that has stayed with me for the last 40 years, so that was a major thing, and it's something that always sticks with me. And whatever I'm sort of conscious of, or sort of like questioning myself, that's it there in the background all the time. What you are is not necessarily better than anybody else, and it's sort of quite hard to explain, really. But everybody's got good things. It's not only one color.
I think what's useful is that you bring us again to really thinking about the assumptions around whiteness, and the assumptions that whiteness brings, and that's about privilege. And this is why I was saying the conversations connect so much to each other as I've been listening to them all. That those assumptions have an impact, and that hence the question as a social worker, what is the impact? And you've given a really good example of that, and about the depth of our thinking then that we need to do to try and deal, or how we deal with that, with that, with those kind of assumptions there. Yeah. What impact does who I am, and if I'm white and holding all this white privilege in this society, what do I need to do about, how do I need to think about it? And what is it that I can do and can't do? And importantly, what is the impact that it's having on, on our practice? And, we don't, as practitioners, get enough time, I don't think personally, to think about that kind of detail as we shift and move in practice. But, it's like, obviously, like opportunities like these will ask us to ask that extra question.
Okay, that's really good.
In practice. Yeah. Thank you.
Abby's put something in the chat about being self-aware is essential to our roles as professionals. Yes, I am Black, and I am aware I have a strong accent, which I openly discuss with service users and their families at that first contact.
Yeah, I think that's, you know, because we're starting to have, you know, questions asked, and it has been in the academies. So students have complained about Black lecturers' accents, you know, and all of those engagements as a person has an impact on you, yeah, in terms of racial trauma. You know, if we're in situations where we're in the majority white, then we need to be able to have a way of being in practice that enables us to think about that, and then enables us to also challenge them in the rest of the team. Yeah, I had my examples somehow become amusing over the years, but I was sitting in a which I saw as a kind of a microaggression, really, and people have kind of hinted at this before about names and stuff like that. But I was waiting to be called in a it was in a hospital, and I was waiting to be called in for my turn to see the consultant, and I watched a nurse come out of a door, and she had a file in her hand, and she looked at it for a bit, then she went back in again, and then she came out again, and she looked at the file again, and then she went back in the room again, and then she came out of the room and came straight across the where people were sitting to me and said, "Is this your name?" And it was actually a Polish name, but the impact of her ideas about difference was so powerful that she thought I must be the only person in the room who would have a name that was unpronounceable in her terms. So I use that example because that is the depth, really, of what happens in situations of both microaggressions and our assumptions that come with our racism that is really deep within us. And I just said to her, "No, I'm really sorry. My name is Philomena Harrison. It's, you know, it's quite easy. You know, you can say that." You know. And she went off and then had to have the thing of trying to say the name. Yeah. So, you know, and we tend to do that. And you know, lots of people particularly in some Chinese communities, people change their name because they cannot face the trauma of people not being able to pronounce their names. Yeah. Which is about, your name is so important. It's your identity. It's who you are. And, you know, let's not make us put people in situations where they have to do that. Okay. So, shall I carry on, Nicola? Any other?
I'll just share.
So, right. Okay. So, so I think maybe let's see if we can think about things in particular in terms of being aware of our own thoughts and actions when working with BAME service users. What might we do in thoughts, actions, and behaviors which may lead to service users disengaging with us as social work practitioners? So can we have a little think about that in terms of what is it that I may or may not do, I will do, that stops somebody from a Black, Asian, minority ethnic group not wanting to work with us. Can we have a quick think about that, please?
Angela, are you on mute?
Sorry, it wouldn't unmute. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
We can.
Hiya. Yeah, I just think, obviously, like as a white social work student, I think the first thing to acknowledge is your white privilege straight away, something that I hadn't really thought about until going to Hope University, which is like really passionate about racism and race. And I think that's the first thing as a social work practitioner. You need to acknowledge that. You need to, and it's not about going in and, you know, saying, "Oh, I've got more privileges than you," but, you know, being aware that people of Black ethnic minorities have probably faced a lot more barriers in their life than you have. And then I think another important thing is what you mentioned before, is about making assumptions. And I think that's in every context, really, not just working with Black people, but I think assumptions are very dangerous. And if you make assumptions about people, you know, it can be harmful, and half the time you're probably not going to be right. And surely as a social work practitioner, you should just be more humanistic and just get to know the person as a person, not because of the colour of the skin or where they come from, or just get to know them as a person, get to know the family, and then you're more likely to build up a good relationship with them.
Thank you. Thank you. And it's those kind of very basic things, aren't they, Angela, which are part of social work practice, but it's taking all of those basic skills and ideas and maybe framing them through the lens of thinking about what is racial trauma, yeah, in those situations, yeah. Any other things that we might do, Craig?
Yeah, I think I've come across it in the past where Black and Asian minorities, you've gone in and they've had a negative experience beforehand, so your job's twice as hard before you even start, because you've got to gain that trust that's been broken once before. And it can be very hard sometimes to like say, regain that trust that it wasn't you that broke it, it was a different service that broke it. Mm-hmm. And they just do not trust the public services anymore. Mm-hmm. It's very hard to gain the trust back again, and obviously give a good service.
Yeah. And I think I don't know how far people feel that they can have those conversations, you know, about say, for example, you're working with a service user who has had, you know, is a Black young man who's always had, you know, white social workers, and he you know, and you meet up with him and he says, well, it's all the same again, isn't it? What would the conversation be like? I don't know. People have any thoughts about that, to try and change that reality, because it's that person's reality, that we're trying to deal with, you know. I don't know what you think.
And you can't change the fact that you're white, and you know, you just can't change that. And it very is. I've got a case at the moment, and it's the same situation, and it is very hard to. That person's trust has been gained, but it's very fragile at the moment.
Yeah.
It's because you've got a different attitude than everybody else who's been around them. You're different to them for some reason. You're gaining the trust, but it's very fragile. It can be easily broken. It's quite difficult.
So, Angela, did you want to come back on that for Craig?
No, but I will, Philomena. I just think it's about people. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, people, you gain people's respect, trust by treating them with respect. And it's about you starting off on a clean slate. And if you're going in to visit that family, irrespective of what's gone on before, it's the impression and the relationship that you have with that person. And they're going to know from the offset what your feelings are. So it's about being open and honest and transparent with people. And if it's about education or training or lack of knowledge, then you ask those questions, because how can we learn if we're not prepared to go there and have those sensitive conversations? But I think trust is built on how you treat people and how people treat you. And you would expect people to treat you as you would like to be treated, with respect and dignity. And I think, especially when you're going into people's houses, they're allowing you into their home, which is intrusive. So you're going in there as a guest. So you're not superior in any way. They're allowing you into their home. So just be respectful and act as a guest. Sorry, but I'm just like dead passionate about it. So sorry, Philomena.
No, absolutely.
I'll mute myself again.
No, please don't. I mean, I think it's really important, you know, what you're talking about is the kind of, what does a social worker need to do, So it's that activity, yeah, that engagement, yeah, that commitment, that taking of the risks, yeah, in these situations. And I think, you know, I think I said it earlier when I was rambling on at the beginning, was about the risks that we have to take in having these conversations within the teams, but also having the conversations with service users. And as you say, you know, having that respect, but that respect being having an informed knowledge base, yeah, to be able to have those conversations which have a like as good an outcome as possible, yeah, in those circumstances, and taking the risks. And not least, Angela, is the passion. You know, I'm a great advocate in that, having that passion, and you know, that passion will be influenced by you gaining more knowledge, by you taking those risks, and learning, you know, from experiences with service users. Yeah. Thank you, Angela and Craig.
No, I always have Philomena, I always have this saying that people always, it doesn't matter what you do sometimes, they'll always forget what you do, but people never forget how you made them feel.
True.
That's
Yeah.
very important, that.
Yeah. So, you know, it is just going back to the point I was asking you to think about, really, is about our thoughts and actions when working in these circumstances. I think we go into these circumstances very often with great fear, and we tend to then forget that the other person might be fearful as well, you know, of me if I was a white practitioner, you know, going into those situations, and that there is a discomfort that we're all having to sit with and work with, and so we need to be, you know, to our duty as professionals, you know, that we have to think about, you know, what are our thoughts and actions and behaviors which will impact on a Black, Asian, minority ethnic service user, which will be another point in terms of being racially traumatized. I don't know whether anybody has any other comments, or, you know, these are conversations, these are just pointers on which you can build on.
Philomena, I'm just thinking about so it's Karen again. I'm just thinking about again, kind of previous practice,
Yeah.
and challenges that I had from working with a Black male, autism, and looking at appropriate supported accommodation for him, and going through the court of protection, and working with this family. I completely resonate with Craig. I was, you know, and I was challenged by the family to say, and I use these quotes as another well-mannered white girl coming to help us. And I think I was very questioned how well I could advocate for the, you know, sort of this Black, you know, this Black male, so, you know, service user, but also his family, against the court of protection, but also against a local authority, who were my my boss as well. So that was a really interesting dynamic, and I can't stress enough, it was trying to build that trust, and not assuming that this was what was needed, you know, just listening, active listening, and not making assumptions.
I think, Karen, it's a really kind of important point at this point in our conversation for today, really, is about that you as a white practitioner, you're facing the challenge from the family and the service user, but you're also having to deal with that in the context of a racist society, yeah, a context of a racist social work system. And that is a huge difficult, that's a huge, I was going to say burden, but it feels like a burden, but it's a huge responsibility, really, for you, you know, as you quite rightly say, as a practitioner. So how can you work to make that family believe, yeah, that you are more than the system, yeah? You are trying to work in a different way from the system. And that is such a, it's an important task for you as a practitioner, but not an easy one, you know. And you will find it easier, I think, to suggest this, is if you have actually, which this is not me assuming, but if we have dealt with our own, for example, white privilege, yeah? If we understand that, then we're better placed to think through these things on behalf of our service users, yeah? And your awareness of it, I think, is the most important and starting point.
But I mean, I do think, looking back now, and reflection, hindsight is a great thing. I think I fought more because I was challenged. And
yeah,
whether that's the right thing or the wrong thing, but I know I fought more because I wanted to prove a point to the family, and it was a good outcomes, and it was positive outcomes all the way through. But that's not always the case. So I think I was very lucky on this occasion.
Yeah. But thank you. That's a very useful for me to think through what I'm trying to think about, you know, because we're all in the process in developing these conversations. We're trying to think about what is it that we want to talk about, what is it that we want to share. And I think the whole each one teach one model is about that kind of flow of information and that feedback, yeah, and that kind of loop in terms of what we want to learn. I guess, Nicola, we're getting near the time, and
we are, yes.
Yeah, so I just wanted to, from my point of view again, because I have the stage and the privilege of being able to speak above everybody else at this moment in time, is I just want to really remind people again that the pledge that we want to think about, I want you to think about, is that, and you will never be able to do anything different in working in terms of racial trauma, is if you don't start off with the premise that we have to acknowledge that people who have experienced racism, yeah, will have experienced it as a traumatic event, that it's racial trauma. And I think that that's what we have to hold to trying to work in this particular, and think about and have the conversations about racial trauma. But thank you, everybody. I've learned lots more today as well. Thank you.